Hello everyone, and welcome to the Tavern. We're back with some more X-Men. This episode is not quite what I expected. Last week I kept teasing about Operation Zero Tolerance, and that really isn't what we got. In fact, I can't even call it an adaptation of Operation Zero Tolerance, even though yes, it has Bastion, and yes, it has the Prime Sentinels, and a few other scenes that are evocative of the event, but for the most part, it's really not the event at all. In fact, it took me some time to actually sort out my thoughts of this episode. There's a lot I need to discuss. But first, I do have a correction from last week. Last time I called the Human Sentinel Hybrid an Omega Sentinel. These are actually Prime Sentinels. Omega Sentinels would actually come later in the timeline. But they still function in a very similar way, being a Human Sentinel Hybrid that is designed to be able to strike mutants as soon as they sense them. And in many ways, the Prime Sentinel and the Omega Sentinels work very similarly. The Omega Sentinels are the more advanced version. And yes, when I'm saying Omega, I mean Omega class, not Omega Sentinel the character. Because yeah, that doesn't make this at all confusing. Anyhow, my mistake. I have too much X-Men lore in my brain, and as soon as I saw it, that was the first thing I went to instead of the Prime Sentinels, which are the Human Sentinel hybrids produced by Bastion and the Zero Tolerance organization. Now that that's been cleared up, we're going to start the review, and I will do my best to keep the spoilers to a minimum. So our story picks up not too long after last episode. The X-Men have returned back to the mansion and are trying to figure out what their next step is. Cable ends up expositing a little bit about what he knows about Bastion and what the X-Men need to do to try to stop the potential dark future that will come if Bastion wins. Meanwhile, we cut to Bastion, who is expositing his plan and his motivations as well. Lots of exposition in this episode. It doesn't flow as nicely as it could, but it does get that information to the viewer. The X-Men end up getting information as to a potential base for Zero Tolerance, and they go check it out. In the process, they get Bastion's backstory because they look at some artwork and get told some things by a very convenient character. It kind of ruins the cool mystery about Bastion way too soon, and it's not great. After that, we get the big battle. We have one team of X-Men battling in the town, we have another team of X-Men battling at the mansion, and we have Jubilee and Sunspot getting chased through a mall by a Prime Sentinel, because of course Jubilee has to have a mall battle. I mean, it's part of her character's backstory after all. All these fights are fairly well done, especially the mansion fight when you watch Wolverine and Nightcrawler fighting together. And yes, Nightcrawler pulls out his swords and starts wrecking Prime Sentinels. It's great. I love seeing the two of them just go buck wild, wrecking all these cyborgs. The action is easily the highlight of this episode, because a lot of it is great, including reenacting a scene from Zero Tolerance, where Cyclops ends up blasting some Prime Sentinels that are chasing the Blackbird. Then we have our ending, and I'm not going to spoil how this episode wraps up. However, it put me into a position of, uh-oh, we are diverging towards something else. And I have my theories about it, but at this point, this whole episode kind of went in weird directions that I have no idea what they're doing next. I can guess, but overall, this makes me a bit worried for the overall ending of the show. On the good side, we get some decently handled themes this episode. First off, family comes up yet again, which makes sense. That's always an ongoing thing with the X-Men. It's a found family story. And this time around, we have Jean Grey and Nightcrawler discussing their feelings about family, about Madeline Pryor, about everything that's been happening, and how the X-Men need each other as a team, but also as a family. It's well handled, and the Nightcrawler speech is excellent. We also have the theme of fighting the future, which also happens literally as the X-Men battle against the Prime Sentinels. We also have Bastion's point of view on fighting the future, leading to a very interesting dichotomy where both sides are fighting the futures that they fear. And that really helps emphasize the theme of this episode, and I appreciate that. Characters, I have some mixed feelings on. First off, Cable is fully in this episode. He is fighting alongside his dad. It's pretty cool. He dumps a bunch of exposition because this episode has a lot of exposition. The problem with Cable in this show is the problem with Cable in the 90s, which is that he doesn't have a lot of personality. He is big, tough guy with some mutant powers and a gun. And in this episode, he is big tough guy with some mutant powers and a gun. It's hard to complain about Cable matching Cable, but it does come off a bit odd when everyone else seems to have very distinctive personalities, and Cable is just tough guy. We then have Nightcrawler. Nightcrawler is great. We not only get him pulling out his swords and having a really great action sequence, we also get him showing the philosophical side of himself when he talks with Jean, giving him a lot more character. If this gets a season 2, I really want Nightcrawler to remain a core member of the team because he is one of the coolest X-Men in my opinion, and there's so much you can do with him as both a swashbuckler and as a philosopher. Finally, we have Bastion. I have very mixed feelings on this character, primarily because in the comics, he was very enigmatic. He's around for a while before the Operation Zero Tolerance event occurs, as kind of this in-the-shadows bad guy you don't really know a lot about. Even when Zero Tolerance starts, they really build up his mystery, and the way he interacts with Jubilee, Cable, and J. Jonah Jameson really show these different fragments of his personality. And frankly, the version we got was like, I'm turning people into cyborgs, mwahahaha. And it just isn't right. I'm sorry. Like, Bastion's a really interesting villain in my opinion. There's a lot of depth to him, there's a lot of layers to him, and the mystery aspects of him made him an interesting character when he showed up in the comics. And here he just is like, hey, I'm here, I'm evil, deal with it. It's just such a letdown for Bastion overall, when they could have done so much more with him. I actually would have preferred him be a minor villain for the remainder of this season and really build into the Zero Tolerance storyline in season 2. But this is what they gave us. On the audio side of things, the music is really good in this episode, really gets your heart pumping. It really fits the action sequences, and I think they did a good job with it. I also very much like Cable's voice. I think his actor does a good job, considering that Cable is usually a very reserved character. The fact that you can get that little tone of annoyance when he has to deal with Cyclops, or his ability to show what limited compassion he has when they're exploring Bastion's hometown, really add layers to a character that is generally a shallow character. And I think the actor did a great job with Cable. Bastion, on the other hand, doesn't work for me. In my mind, when I read the comics, and even going back and rereading them prior to this event happening to refresh myself on the story, my version of Bastion has a deeper, more menacing voice. Greetings, I am Bastion. Zero Tolerance will not stand for mutants taking over our planet. That kind of a voice. And we got like generic guy voice for Bastion. It's just very, I am Bastion. I am making robots to fight against the X-Men. Ha 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 ha. And it's so, oh god, I can't believe they fumbled this character so badly. Finally, I was really surprised that this episode had a reference to Gundam Seed Destiny. Because Jubilee goes, you people. And I'm like, oh my gosh, that's the line. That's Shin's final line in Gundam Seed Destiny. That's crazy. At least I assume that's what it's supposed to be a reference to. On the visual side of things, we got some really awesome fights. As you probably know, because I've been saying it over and over and over again. But I really do appreciate how good the action is. It really shows the effort they put into the show to not just make standard punch and bad guy fall down. In the battles, we see what kind of threat the Prime Sentinels really are, as they keep pulling out their weapons and utilizing different defenses. Meanwhile, we get to see the X-Men just go crazy with their powers, blasting left and right, fighting to survive. It's really good and really gets your adrenaline going as you're getting really hyped up with the fight. As I made comment earlier, we actually get a reenactment of a sequence from Operation Zero Tolerance. In the scene, the Blackbird is under attack, and Cyclops uses a hole in the Blackbird to essentially go full blast with his optic beam to take down the Prime Sentinels. And in this battle, we even get Cable helping out, which is really cool. The scene is very different than the original scene in the comics, but the action and the results remain the same, and therefore, I really do like how that was handled. I have one minor complaint about the visuals in this episode. Cable is not in the title sequence. They do change up the title sequence to show the different characters that are part of the team. Cable was a full member of the team this episode. He had a lot of lines and was intrinsic to the story, not in the opening sequence. Bishop barely did anything in the episodes he showed up in, part of the title sequence. I'm just saying, like, it'd be nice, just throw Cable in there, like, blasting a bunch of stuff, and it says Cable, it says Cable, and then he body slides in or something. You could do something cool with that. Just come on, guys. 2 more episodes, please throw Cable into the title sequence. As I move towards my wrap-up, I always love to bring up TV standards and why this would have problems in the 90s. The usage of the word murder would never have been allowed. At a certain point, Cyclops says, "Let's show them what happens when you screw with the Summers family." And while I think that line is awesome, obviously that wouldn't have been allowed, and the violence levels are a bit high for a Saturday morning cartoon. I just love bringing this up. It still makes me smile every time I think about how, like, censored as hell this episode would have been in the 90s, and I just think that's kind of a fun point to bring up. It doesn't affect the score, it just makes me happy. What does affect the score is the episode itself and the writing, because we are obviously not getting Operation Zero Tolerance here. We will probably have a few scenes evocative of the event, but outside of Bastion and some Prime Sentinels, based on the ending, we're going a really different direction, and it might sound weird, but I'm getting really strong Fatal Attractions vibes. And I'm not going to spoil the ending of the episode, but I feel like they're combining a lot of different little pieces of the 90s comics to make this final arc. It's definitely putting me in a position of worrying, because this is where they could really fumble the ball, and it would really suck if the last 2 episodes were terrible. It took me a while to figure out the score for this episode. When I've thought about it deeply, and even used my rubric, it did kind of waffle between 2 different scores. In the end, I took the lower of the 2 scores, primarily because the more I think about this episode, the more I don't like it. That being said, it's not a terrible episode, and the score is 3 out of 5. We have some major issues with how Bastion is handled. We do have issues with the story just dumping a lot of exposition, with even a to be continued that isn't all that great in my opinion. But worst of all of that is the sheer amount of Prime Sentinels Bastion has created in the background. Apparently every non-mutant is just a Prime Sentinel now. There are way too many of them, and it's getting to the point of being a little bit ridiculous, when what made the Prime Sentinels threatening was that there weren't that many of them, but they were really, really difficult to destroy. And now we just got a horde of them, and somehow the X-Men are just going to overcome this? Come on. Also, I hate the idea that Bastion can just grab randos off the street, turn them into Prime Sentinels, and then dump them back on the street again. When in the comics, the Prime Sentinels were primarily made up of members of Zero Tolerance and a handful of others in order to have Bastion's master plan come to fruition, which makes a lot more sense rather than being able to just pump these things out like in a factory. I just don't like it. Scott Lobdell might not be the greatest comic book writer, but his 90s stuff is relatively solid. You had a good framework to work with, and instead you are doing whatever it is you just did, and it really makes me worried about the ending. So all that being said, let me know what you thought of this episode in the comments, and until next time, thank you for watching, please like and subscribe, and I'll see you at the tavern.